For about 5 years now, I've been a ranger at Okefenokee Swamp Park. It's the biggest blackwater swamp in the whole damn United States, taking up a huge chunk of southeast Georgia. The place is massive, home to all kinds of critters, foxes, gators, even the occasional bear. But over the years, I've learned that it ain't just wildlife lurking in those shadows. There's something else out there. Not human, of course, but the swamp hides its secrets well. One of my earliest memories of this weirdness was back in my 3rd year as a junior ranger. I was a young buck then, maybe 25, fresh on the job. They were slowly giving me more responsibilities, and I finally got to the point where I could do patrols on my own. They handed me the keys to the fan boats, the ones we used to get into the really deep parts of the swamp. And that's when I got my first real scare. It was getting dark, and some folks came into the station, saying they'd been hiking and lost one of their buddies. Not unusual, to be honest. If you take a wrong turn in the Okefenokee, it's nothing but water and thick trees as far as the eye can see. Unless you've got a damn good sense of direction, you're gonna get lost real quick. The sun was setting, and they said they hadn't seen their friend for hours, even though they'd been calling out for him the whole way back. So, it fell on me to go out and search. Maria, my partner on duty that night, took their report while I grabbed the big ass flashlight we use for night searches, the boat keys, and headed out. They said they'd come from the western part of the swamp, a densely wooded area that floods like crazy. Not ideal, considering the storm clouds were gathering overhead. The moon was playing peek-a-boo, ducking behind the clouds and plunging me into darkness every few minutes. The trees cast creepy shadows, and every little rustle or splash made me jump. As the night wore on, the mosquitoes came out in full force. Millions of the little bastards swarming around me, almost blocking out the flashlight beam. It was hard enough to see anything through the shadows, but with those bugs creating their own shadows in the distance, it really messed with my head. The heat didn't help either, making my clothes stick to my sweaty skin. I'd been out there for maybe 2 hours, the moon high overhead, when the first drops of rain started to fall. Slow at first, just a drop here and there, with thunder rumbling in the background. Every now and then, lightning would flash, illuminating the whole swamp in a blinding white light, and that's when I started to notice them. At first, they looked like people hiding behind trees, obscured by shadows and branches. Some were taller than others. Some were a pale, sun-bleached white, while others looked like they were covered in mold and dirt. I barely caught a glimpse of the first one as it ducked behind a tree. All I saw was a hand with long, white fingers before it disappeared back into the darkness. About 10 minutes later, I saw another one. This time, it was clearer. It was standing in the middle of the trees, partially submerged in the water and muck. From the waist up, it was a mostly decayed body, stripped down to the bone by bugs and weather. Ribs with rotting flesh hanging off them. It vanished as quickly as my light hit it, one rotting eye still staring at me from its skull as it sank back into the water. I was starting to freak out. I tried to radio Maria back at the station, but I couldn't get a signal. Finally, I reached the area where they said they'd lost their friend, and I started yelling for him, even though I was scared shitless. I guess I was able to rationalize everything I'd seen up to that point. It was my first time out in the swamp alone, especially this late at night, and the weather wasn't exactly calming my nerves. Ahead of me, the trees opened up into a clearing. Just a small pond, with no roots or trunks breaking the surface. The rain stopped suddenly, and the moon emerged from behind the clouds, shining down on the black water. And there, standing in the middle of the clearing, with her hands stretched up to the sky as if begging the moon to come down, was a body. Well, body might be putting it mildly. This thing was stripped of all flesh, empty sockets where the eyes should be. It was staring up at the moon, and from where I was in the boat, I could see it was dressed in a long, flowing white gown, almost like a wedding dress. I couldn't tell if it was looking up in longing, reverence, or both. As it reached further towards the moon, it was standing on top of the water as if it were solid ground. Not even a ripple disturbed the surface. It was glowing in the moonlight. And then, as I watched, more skeletons and decaying bodies emerged from the water, gliding upwards to surround the skeletal bride. They grabbed her, dragging her back down below the surface, as the moon disappeared behind the clouds again. I shone my flashlight over to see if anything was still there, but the clearing was empty. Just shadows dancing on the water. I turned the boat around and got the hell out of there. We ended up finding the missing guy the next day. Somehow, he'd wandered all the way to one of the nearby highways. Must have been a hell of a walk. When I told Maria about the skeletons and bodies in the water, she just looked at me like I was crazy. About a year later, we had a murder. Or at least, that's what they called it at first. Some poor girl's body was found floating in one of the more touristy areas, completely drained of blood. All they could find was one puncture wound between her neck and shoulder. It wasn't from any animal known to be in the park. So, the Georgia Bureau of Investigations came in to poke around. I got paired up with a GBI guy named Sully to lead him around the swamp. We were supposed to be looking for any sign of where she was killed or a possible weapon. Sully was a good guy, and we ended up becoming friends in the couple of weeks we spent scouring the Okefenokee. One thing we agreed on was that the amount of destruction being done to the environment out here needed to stop. There was a mining operation about to start nearby, extracting lithium through strip mines right outside the damn swamp borders. And that was just the latest issue. For decades, some of the major train yards had been dumping chemicals that were only now coming to light. God knows it added to the cancer clusters that had been popping up in the kids around here, taking them way too young. But what we found one night, almost a week after we started our investigation, made us both realize that the problems were only going to get worse. Another body had turned up a day earlier, causing a whole other mess for the GBI. This one was a big guy. They matched him up with a trucker that had gone missing a couple of weeks ago. His rig was found empty and abandoned on the side of the highway. His body was pretty messed up, decay setting in, but he had a similar wound with the same telltale sign, completely drained of blood. Sully and I spent the next day tracking deep into the swamp, trying to figure out where the bodies could be coming from. We followed the faint currents through the water, and after about 7 hours of searching, we found something. It was a shallow clearing in the middle of the northeast quadrant. Tons of trees clustered around it, keeping it mostly closed off, but there was a small gap that basically became a floodgate when it rained. We figured that's what was letting the bodies loose, allowing them to drift over to the more populated areas of the swamp where they were being found. And we were right. We definitely found the source of the dead people. Inside this clearing, bodies were piled up in various states of decay. Every single one drained of blood. The newest corpse was probably only a few days old at most. Alabaster white skin glowing against the dark water. The whole area reeked of death, the smell mixing with the decay from rotting trees and vegetation. It was worse than the time I found a rotting bear near the park entrance, poor bastard almost torn in half by a car. They all had the same puncture wound, though it was on different sides for some of them. Probably just depended on where the killer was able to get a good angle, I guess. Sully pulled out his radio to call back to the station and let them know what we'd found. But they said it was going to be a while before anyone could come out, thanks to some emergency in town. Downside of living in the rural South, resources are spread thin. We were just going to have to set up and wait. But in the meantime, we had our own plan. In case the killer came back, we parked our boat a little ways away downstream, anchoring it to a tree out of sight. Then we got out, waders and boots on to keep from getting soaked, and made our way back towards the clearing. The sun was getting low, and we knew we'd have to find a good spot soon to make sure nothing took us by surprise. Luckily, one of the old ranger outposts was nearby, a small, rotting cabin built up on rickety platforms. We crammed ourselves inside, getting ready for what could be a long night. A couple of hours passed with nothing. I think I even dozed off on one of the rusty folding chairs. The place was bare, an old landline phone on the wall, a small desk in the corner, and one dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Damn thing didn't even work, and there probably wasn't any power coming in anyway. Sully went outside to look around while I was snoozing, and when he woke me up, he showed me why we didn't have any power. The small posts with the electrical wires were ripped out of the ground. Just a frayed wire hanging loose above the water. Major safety hazard. But it's not like anyone ever came out this far. We started checking the further reaches of the swamp a lot more often after this, hoping to avoid another pile of bodies turning up. By the time we realized our serial killer was something way worse than some sick human, the sun was long gone. Sully had a fancy pair of night vision binoculars, and we were taking turns watching the clearing, desperately trying to spot anyone coming up before they got too close. Our worst fear was that they'd show up with another body to dump, probably drained of blood again. And that fear became reality just a few minutes after midnight. Nobody had shown up yet, and Sully and I were debating whether to just drop a GPS marker and head back to the station. I was on watch, scanning the area with the binoculars, when suddenly there was a figure standing in the clearing. This thing was huge, at least 9 feet tall. It was holding another body, limp and lifeless. It flung the body next to a tree, and it crumpled to the water below. I grabbed Sully, pointed towards the clearing, and handed him the binoculars. His gasp was something I'll never forget. The thing turned towards us, and we got a good look at it. This giant bastard was like Mothman's messed up southern cousin. Rows of stiff spines running down its arms and legs. It had at least 6 arms sprouting from its body. 2 ended in sharp points, which we initially thought it used to kill its victims. The others had human-like hands, but the fingers were deadly sharp at the tips. Then it looked at the body it had just tossed aside, and something unfurled from its face. Huge red eyes glowed in the moonlight, reflecting off everything around it. As its mouth stretched open, I realized it was a sharp, needle-like beak. It plunged the beak into the fresh body. I couldn't tell what it was doing, but the body started to shiver, something squirming beneath the skin. That was all Sully and I needed to see. We had no idea what the hell this thing was, other than an abomination against God. Luckily, the situation with the supposed murderer meant we were allowed to carry firearms. We both drew our weapons. Sully had a rifle, and I had a standard issue pistol. We grabbed a couple of old flares from the desk, just in case, and moved out. We made it to the edge of the clearing, still hidden from the creature. Sully poked his rifle barrel around the corner, waiting for the right moment. Then the damn thing turned and locked its giant red eyes with mine. It wasn't human, that's for sure. And the only thing behind those eyes was the desire to feed, breed, and eat some more. This was the stereotypical southern pest turned into my worst nightmare. As soon as it saw us, Sully fired. He hit it in one arm, and the thing took off flying. We both fired after it, and I think one of our shots hit its wing because it lost lift and started falling. I fired again, hitting it in the lower jaw, taking out that massive needle mouth. One more shot, and we could take this thing out. But my clip was empty, and when I went to reload, the Mosquito Man rushed at us. I fumbled the new clip, dropping it into the dark water. The creature slammed into Sully, sending him flying backwards before splashing down into the muck. I started running back towards the outpost, picking Sully up as I went. He'd lost his gun in the fall, so we were out of luck when it came to defenses. We hauled ourselves up onto the outpost platform, and I slammed the door behind us, pulling the deadbolt. It snapped with rust. A moment later, a loud thump shook the whole outpost. The creature had landed on the platform outside. There was nothing we could do but press ourselves against the back wall hoping it might lose interest and leave. Now would have been a great time for some backup to arrive, but no such luck. One of the sharp arms busted through the thin wooden door, tearing a chunk out as it was pulled back. The thing was coming in, forcing itself through the small doorway and ripping out the wooden panels. We had little chance of getting away, but we had to try. I opened the shutter over the back window, exposing a dingy pane of glass about half my size. I smashed it with my elbow and pulled Sully out with me as the creature got closer. Uncapping the last flare, I threw it into the window behind me, letting the bright flame ignite the old, rotting wood inside. We scrambled back, trying to make our way from behind the outpost back to our boat before the thing got out. The scream that damn thing let out was something I'll never forget. It sounded like dozens of voices, crying out at once as the flames licked at its skin. I saw the window burst outwards. The wall around it blasted out as the flames reached closer to us. The creature fell out, its body half on fire and sizzling as it hit the water below. We had to get out of there. Water was splashing up through my waders, chilling me in the humid air. I could see blue sparks coming from a few feet away in the darkness, the live wire on the post that Sully had pointed out earlier. It was a risky idea, but if it meant I could take the bastard out with me, I'd try it. It was gurgling up from the water now, clumsily slashing its way towards us. Nothing was going to stop it. I made my way as quickly as I could over to the post. My waders were made of rubber, so I hoped this half-baked scheme would work. As the thing got closer, I reached out, grabbed onto it, and used its own off-balance momentum to swing it around. It landed right on target, face first into the live wire. I felt a brief shock as my hands let go of its body, and smoke started rising from it as it convulsed on top of the post. A couple of moments passed before the wire shorted out and the creature went limp. The outpost was still burning around us as we both lifted the body, bringing it towards the massive pyre it had become. We threw it on top, letting it burn away before it had any chance to pull some voodoo shit and come back at us. There was no sound from it now, just the crackling of flames as the outpost burned, smoke rising into the sky above. Then screams started coming from the clearing. This time, they were higher pitched than before, all in a terrible discordance that sounded like the choir of hell. We covered our ears, looking back to the clearing as the moonlight illuminated three small bodies, each one maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. One of them took to the air, its massive needle mouth extending beneath glowing red eyes. This thing was nesting its eggs in the dead bodies, reproducing. I went back to the boat, grabbed the flare gun and a can of gasoline, while Sully made his way to the small ones. They didn't put up much of a fight, thankfully, and he was able to crush them relatively easily underfoot. We started moving every body we could find, piling them in the dreest place we could before dousing them in gasoline. When they were soaked, we went back to the boat, carefully aimed the flare gun at the pile, and pulled the trigger. Every body in that pile went up in flames that night. I still don't know who all of them were, and it's likely their poor families may never get closure. But after seeing what that thing had nested in them, I think we did them a service burning the bodies. Sully and I both gave the same report, though the GBI didn't seem to believe it. Every time we've talked about it since, we've wondered if it was just some freak of nature, a cryptid, or a mutant abomination created by the pollution taking hold. My bet's on the pollution. Chemicals probably getting into the mosquito's spawn and creating, well, those bastards. We've made it a point, whenever bodies turn up in the swamp now, to watch them for a few days, making sure they don't reproduce into more of those damned things. Despite how terrifying it could be out there in the Okefenokee, there were times when the supernatural stuff could be oddly beautiful. There's this phenomenon, I still don't really know if it's natural or something more otherworldly, but I've seen it enough to know it ain't entirely normal. Swamp lights. Small, floating torches in the dark that move on their own. Some folks call them will-o'-the-wisps. or foxfire. Others think it's some kind of ball lightning or a combination of swamp gas and heat. But those of us at the ranger station have come to realize it's something a little more than that. We'd see them maybe every other week, faint glows in the distance from our outpost, or along the tree line while we were on patrol. There was no telling where they'd turn up, but we knew if they were out there. We had some searching to do. Every time a swamp light popped up, floating above the water, it was like a beacon guiding us to something. And that something was usually a body. Someone who got lost or wandered into the wrong area. It wasn't terrifying, really. More just sad. Every time we saw one, it was a sign to get out the nets and drag the water. Granted, that wasn't always the case. We think some of them were just stray spirits, unable to move on even after their bodies were taken for burial. I think they got lonely sometimes, just floating out there in search of someone, something to acknowledge that they were once there. One night, I was out on the main station platform, looking out at the trees, when I saw what looked like Christmas lights blinking in and out, but way bigger than any of the fireflies we had out here. It sent a shiver down my spine. I hoped I wasn't about to stumble upon a mass grave or something. But the lights were just there, zipping over the water, chasing each other playfully. We dredged the area the next day, but no bodies came up. All I can assume is that they were just lost souls who finally found each other, enjoying a little company after so long searching in the dark. My last real encounter with the weirdness of the swamp was about 2 years ago. Since then, I've mostly retired to a life as a desk jockey, taking my leave of having to wander through that muck. It was a bright midday, and I was out doing some land survey work, making sure the local wildlife wasn't being overtaken by some invasive plants we'd had popping up. I was near one of the nicer outposts, this one with air conditioning and a couple of amenities, when I decided to take a break for lunch. Since fall was coming, I decided to eat out on the platform and enjoy the view. Nature out there was beautiful, with every shade of green imaginable playing off the sunlight. I think I ended up sitting there for an hour after I finished eating, just taking in the peace and quiet, watching alligators float lazily in the water. I was zoning out, looking at one of the nearby tree banks a couple dozen meters away, when it walked into view. This thing was tall, even taller than the Mosquito Man, maybe 12 feet, and built like a brick house. It looked like it could lift a truck if it wanted to. Dark brown fur matted up and down its body, with small, beady eyes staring out above an elongated snout. Ferocious teeth curled down from its lips, saliva dripping from them as it moved through the mud. I could see sharp claws gripping trees as it hopped from bank to bank, leaving deep furrows in the bark. I don't know if I made a sound or if it just smelled me, but it stopped dead in its tracks and turned, looking right at me. A howl like I've never heard before ripped through the air before it tore into the water, splashing towards me on the platform. I was up and inside so fast, I shook the whole outpost when I slammed the door, and it shook again when the creature slammed against it from the outside. I pulled the deadbolt and chain, hoping to whatever god there was that it wouldn't break through. It kept beating at the door, terrible claws ripping at the other side. I didn't know what it wanted with me, or if I was just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The beating stopped suddenly, replaced by heavy, plodding footsteps walking around the outpost platform. It was looking for another way in. I didn't have any time to waste. Staying out here as long as I had taught me that sometimes it was best to defend myself first, no matter the danger it posed to the wildlife. I ran to the gun locker, pulled out the pump-action shotgun, loaded 2 shells, and cocked it. The monster threw itself against the opposite wall, desperately trying to break it down. I could hear its ferocious growls, like a rabid dog. It was about to pass in front of the window, and I knew I only had one chance to get this right. I raised the gun to my shoulder, aimed square at the window, and held my breath, my finger on the trigger. The creature suddenly ran from the side, slamming a massive claw against the window to break it open. As it started climbing through, I fired. The first shot caught it right in the left shoulder. I pumped the gun again, the kickback more than I was used to. I was gonna be sore for a week. It still tried to come at me, but I fired the second shell, ejected it, and pulled out more to reload. The shot peppered the thing right in the face, blowing off some of the skin around its skull. Despite all that, it just stared at me, unable to close its mangled jaw. Half of its mouth was fixed in a wicked snarl, tears of flesh hanging from the side. Then it turned tail and ran. Explaining the broken window and huge gashes on the door was surprisingly easy. We all had an understanding at this point that weird stuff happens out there, and sometimes the place just needed some repairs. Most of the official expense reports mentioned bad weather, but on occasion, we'd have fun with them, making up random stuff to send off to the state auditors. Like they were gonna come out here and check on it themselves. I haven't seen that damn thing since, thank God. But I have heard some of the younger rangers tell tales of howling late at night and seeing a massive creature walking through the trees just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Shining a light on it only causes bright green eyes to reflect back, and that's usually all it takes for them to turn tail and run. I still work at Okefenokee Swamp Park, but like I said, I stick to the desk jobs now. The younger folks can go out and deal with all the craziness the Okefenokee has to offer. I'll stay right here in the air conditioning, thank you very much. But even from my desk, I can't escape the memories of those encounters. The skeletal bride reaching for the moon, the mosquito man with its glowing red eyes and needle mouth, the hulking beast with the ferocious teeth and claws. They're burned into my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of this beautiful, yet unsettling place. Sully and I still keep in touch, swapping stories and theories about what we saw that night. We both agree that something needs to be done about the pollution that's seeping into the swamp. We can't let those chemicals continue to mutate the wildlife, creating more monsters like the mosquito man. The Okefenokee is a place of incredible beauty and wonder, but it's also a place of danger and mystery. It's a place where the line between the natural and the supernatural blurs, where ancient spirits wander, and where creatures from nightmares roam. It's a place that demands respect, and it's a place that will forever hold a piece of my soul. I may have retired from the front lines, but I'll never truly leave the Okefenokee behind. It's a part of me now, just as I'm a part of its story. And I know that as long as I live, I'll never forget the things I've seen and the secrets I've uncovered in the heart of the swamp.